Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back for the fourth and final session of our Adorno and Communism series. Today, we are joined by Chris O'Kane, our final guest, um, one of two translators of our kind of main text that we're looking at today, Marx and the Basic Concepts of Sociological Theory. Um, I think many of us are probably familiar with Chris's work. Um, but to introduce Chris, to those of you who are not, Chris is a critical theorist. He's published widely on Marx, the Frankfurt School, and Marxian critical theory more generally. He also, as many of you probably already saw in the reminder email, he also has a forthcoming new book called, wait, what is it called again? Social Constitution and Fetishistic Social Domination in Marx, Lukács, Adorno, and Lefebvre. And so there's a HM book launch, virtual book launch event tomorrow morning for those of you who are interested. Um, Cool. So I think, as usual, Chris is going to guide us through the two texts, and then we'll open it up for Q&A and discussion after. But yeah, welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to my presenters for presenting their important work in the previous sessions. What I'm going to do today is sort of introduce. I'm mostly going to talk about the seminar. I'm going to talk a little about static and dynamic, more towards the end. But what I want to do is sort of introduce the seminar first by talking about like how and why it was translated, and then a little bit about how I have used it. But mostly I just want to sort of open it up to discussion. But first I want to talk a little bit about its prehistory. Uh, I don't know, maybe some of you already know this, but just to reiterate, it's a transcript that was taken in shorthand by Hans-Georg Backhaus when he was a student. It's basically his notes from this talk that Adorno gave in 1962. And he later sort of credited the seminar as part of what motivated his research into Marx's theory of value. It was first published as an appendix to an essay collection of his earlier, more influential work, which also confusingly has the same name as his most widely influential and translated article. Both are called On the Dialectic of the Value Form. And this transcript was supposed to be published in issue 25 of Common Sense. Common Sense was a journal that was edited by members of the Conference for Socialist Economists in Edinburgh, Scotland. And I think the editors were a revolving cast of characters in addition to Richard Gunn and Werner Bonefeld. And the transcript was actually scheduled to be published in like 2000, but the journal folded right before this issue was published. So it never came out in Common Sense, even though I think I found a footnote talking about how it was going to be published. And now there's like a website with all of the different issues of Common Sense online you can go to and download them all. There's some interesting stuff in there. Anyway, so my email records indicate that I must have found out about this transcript sometime before 2010, and what I guess would have been sort of the beginning of my second year of PhD research at the University of Sussex. The topic of my thesis was fetishism. I'd started out by, like many people probably do, by having like this wildly sort of ambitious uh, proposal where I said I was going to focus on like maybe 6 or 8 people. In addition to Marx, Lukács, Adorno, and Lefebvre, I think I also proposed doing De Boer and Benjamin. And one of the readers was like, "That's way too much. You need to knock it down a little." You know, I spent, the reader told me, that they spent something like 8 years doing their PhD, and I didn't want to do the same. So I knocked it down to these 4 figures. And I was, I guess I must have probably have been working on the initial research for this chapter on Adorno. And in his published writing, Adorno makes many compelling statements about the fetish, but he doesn't really discuss, it in the sort of depth, one expects, particularly if you're writing a PhD thesis on this, right? When you really need to sort of scrutinize, particularly if you're in England and, you're surrounded by sort of analytically trained philosophers who really need to know, like, well, what exactly does Adorno mean when he says this? Um, so I was looking around for, further material, which is actually how I came across Werner's work. It's how I came across Backhaus and Reichelt. And at this time, I think maybe it's worth stressing that there was virtually, you know, nothing published on Adorno's relationship to Marx or communism, except for the stuff that had been published in sort of open Marxism and open Marxism related collections, and like a few random things that had been translated and edited collections. Like there's that like Stefan Brewer article about like Adorno's negative anthropology. Um, but anyway, there wasn't much. There was this collection that Holloway had edited that had just come out the previous year. But I found out in my records when I was looking up today that I emailed Werner in the summer of 2010 to see if he had a translation of the transcript that hadn't been published. And he said, maybe, I need to look in my papers, but it hadn't been translated. And this left me in a bit of a quandary because my German was terrible. So, I didn't feel like I was capable of translating it on my own. And also, I didn't actually have a copy of this book where, that I could use as a basis for my translation. So, luckily I was able to obtain like a scan of the appendix. And even more luckily, my friend in my PhD cohort, Verena Erlenbusch, who was doing her thesis on sort of a genealogy of terrorism, was a native German speaker, and she sort of kindly offered to do this quick translation for me. And then I went through and I modified some of the more technical Marxist terms. And then it quickly became the case that the transcript was essential for my PhD thesis chapter on Adorno. And the way that I've interpreted it, it has sort of shaped how I read the seminar now. And I dare say that the topic of the thesis, to this day probably still shapes my interpretation of Adorno's relationship with Marx and communism. And this is because I use the seminar really to focus on how Adorno interprets Marx's theory of value as an immanent critical theory of the social constitution of the fetishistic properties of the exchange abstraction, and how Adorno sort of differentiates this from theories of alienation and reification. And then I use Adorno's statement that this interpretation of Marx is still key to his critical theory, right? To then turn to interpret his more compact statements about these matters in his published work. Uh, this is what I did in my thesis. And then the first time I sort of published this interpretation was in this compressed introduction to the publication of the seminar in HM. Uh, and there's sort of a funny, maybe, side story about that introduction, which I hadn't written like a translation introduction before. So, I thought sort of part of the task of writing a translation introduction was to sort of like hype it, to like make people realize like, why is this thing important that I'm going to spend my time reading it? So that's what I sort of tried to do in this introduction. Uh, which inadvertently sort of led to this article that was later published in Philosophy and Social Criticism that misinterpreted like what my intent was. In the introduction, the author sort of interpreted me trying to be like, "Hey guys, this is like really important. Why don't you read this?" as me making sort of definitive statements. So they wrote this sort of imminent critique of my interpretation of the seminar, uh, and then develop their own interpretation of Adorno's relationship to Marx in a different way. The second time I used this was then in an article in Constellations, which I think maybe you could say there was like a slight movement. I think in the thesis, the focus was more on like, hey, look, Adorno actually has this like, you know, fairly detailed interpretation of Marx. Here is how it fits into his thought. And I think in the constellations piece, I sort of moved to consider, what does Adorno take from Marx? What does he critique from Marx? Finally, right, the transcript is also central to the chapter on Adorno's interpretation of the critique of political economy and the fetish that is in this long delayed book that's based on my thesis, which comes out soon. Uh, so instead of doing like a close reading, I think I'll just read sort of my summary of the transcript from the book. Um, you know, which sort of focuses on these points in the way that I think Adorno sort of modifies this interpretation in his critical theory. So, what I say here is Adorno's interpretation of Marx conceives of the critique of political economy as a double critique of both the economy and liberal theories. Such a critique confronts the liberal self-conception of capitalism as a free and equal society with the reality of unfreedom and exploitation. Adorno's interpretation of the fetishistic properties of the exchange abstraction as a theory of social constitution and fetishistic social domination are central to his interpretation of the critique of political economy. Despite inconsistent usage in terms of how Adorno sort of uses the term fetish or fetishism, commodities are constituted by class antagonistic production for exchange in a process of practical or real abstraction. Consequently, in the ensuing dynamic of accumulation, commodities acquire fetishistic properties and a supra-individual autonomous and inverted dynamic of domination that compels individuals within the class relation to act as character masks. Such a dynamic of accumulation ultimately realizes itself, Marx holds, in breakdown and crises, or at least in Adorno's interpretation of Marx. Moreover, Adorno's interpretation of Marx distinguishes between the class antagonistic relations of exchange, the fetishistic properties of the exchange abstraction, character masks, and reification. For Adorno, the exchange abstraction's fetishistic properties are central elements of the autonomous and inverted uh, character of domination. Reification pertains to the human dependence on the social objectivity of exchange. He also distinguishes this conception from Lukács's notion of reification and the early Marxist notion of alienation. However, Adorno is critical of Marx's understanding of epistemology, which leads him to fuse this interpretation of exchange with the Hegelian notion of the concept. This interpretation of the fetishistic properties of the exchange abstraction is still key to society and central to Adorno's critical theory. So that's my take on the transcript. And like I said, at this point, it's so ingrained in me, we could say it's become second nature. But I'm very curious to hear how other people interpret it and how they think it connects with some of the other themes that we have come up with in the previous session. And on that point, I'm not really going to talk much about static and dynamic, but I sort of suggest originally I was going to discuss this in tandem with late capitalism or industrial society, but I thought in some ways it would be more interesting to switch to talk about static and dynamic because of the way that I think it intersects with some of the themes that were discussed, at least in the first two sessions I attended. Um, in terms of perhaps, what are the relations, what's the relationship between the issues of immanence and transcendence and static and dynamic? Uh, and what about, you know, what do we see in static and dynamic that we don't see in the 1962 seminar in terms of the themes that we saw in the translations that we discussed in the first session in terms of sort of the relationship between society or the relationship between social domination and second nature. So that's my attempt to sort of get the ball rolling. Like I said, I'm interested to hear what other people have to say uh, and how they see what I, you know, have congealed in my own brain in a certain fixed and rigid way. Um, what new perspectives can you bring to this text?
Amazing. Thank you, Chris. Um, cool. So, as usual, open discussion as much as you possibly can. Um, Pose your question not in the chat, but by unmuting. And if you really like us with your video on. Um, and yeah, and again, as usual, feel free to pose this either to Chris as a direct question about the text or the translation or an interpretive question or anything like that, or raise like a general point of discussion for the whole group. Cool. Maybe while everyone gathers their thoughts, I could maybe get the ball rolling with, I think, maybe the basic question of the relationship of this text to the sort of overarching theme of the whole series, which would be this question of the relationship of Adorno and the Frankfurt School more broadly to revolutionary proletarian socialism, a number of concepts that the later value form tradition would house under the heading of traditional Marxism, like we saw in Contra Pollum, the figure of the kind of Leninist party was still being held up as essential for Adorno. In the first text we read on the relationship between critical intellectuals, the proletariat, and the Communist Party, um, there was a similar sort of affirmation of this concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat from Marx, that kind of spans Marx's career from 48 to 75, from the Manifesto and up to Gothic Critique. Um, I guess I was wondering, Chris, how you see the relationship, or if there is anything in this text that would sort of suggest a relationship to this figure of traditional Marxism in the way that value form theory since then has kind of articulated the opposition between Adorno and this thing called um, traditional Marxism. Um, I was thinking one maybe point here that really stuck out to me was that that we both have in the seminar on say like 243, we have moments that sound very close to figures from say negative dialectics, um, where he sort of develops out of Marx this idea of what he calls at the bottom of 243, the primacy of the object over the concept. And this is basically what he will define negative dialectics as is what he calls the preponderance of the object, um, or an attunement or attention to the preponderance of the object. Um, and I think what struck me here was the articulation of the sort of I guess the negative dialectical relationship to this preponderance is grounded on not on that there's a kind of opposition between, say, quantity and quality or something, but rather that bourgeois exchange is justice and injustice at the same time, is what he says. And so this to me would suggest that if if that is the case, then we really are still within the bounds, basically, of a contradiction in bourgeois right and in the sort of claims of the proletariat to its products measured in value terms, right? So this would be maybe one way of saying one can't really think this intervention from Adorno completely coherently from something like a purely what is it, like proletarian abolitionist position or something like anti-work positions of something like later value form theory and like Crisis or Endnotes or people like this. This was my sort of um, inkling of one way to connect this to the previous text, but I'm curious what, yeah, your general sense of this relationship of this, the place of this text in the whole series in this question of traditional Marxism.
Sorry, I have a dog that was yelling in the background, so I was waiting for it to finish. Okay. So this this is an interesting question because this is my brain's a little scrambled at the moment because I'm like, I have this book launch for this book for tomorrow, but I'm also doing the final round of corrections on this second book at the moment. And the second book sort of takes up this point in terms of this notion of immanent critique. And it actually argues that this idea of sort of justice and injustice can be found in at least the people that I focus on. I'm not sure about sort of the value form tradition more in general, because I think in some ways that's kind of um, I think that's kind of, I think that's kind of like in some ways, I think that's kind of like the Western Marxism, like of our time. Uh, Insofar as it's just become this label that's like grouped together like a bunch of people that we like, uh, that in some ways, don't really fit so well together. But the way that I interpret how Adorno and actually you know, Horkheimer, I think, is the first person who makes this argument. It's actually in the postscript to traditional and critical theory uh, about sort of how Marx is doing an immanent critique because the categories of freedom, you know, or equality or justice, really show that what exists is the opposite. Uh, but I think or at least what I argue is, right, that what makes it sort of a critical theory take on this, and I think what might still link it to later interpreters is the argument about how this can be realized. And the way that the only way that it can be realized is right by abolishing capitalism. Now, now the question as to what extent that fits into traditional Marxism, well, that's complicated because I think traditional Marxism is like a thing, you know. Um, I think I think it's in part like a thing that is used for people to like work out their own positions. In terms of, if you think of my argument in this book is, right, it's not helpful to sort of think about like, you know, the Frankfurt School or value form theory. The way to interpret it is it's like there are these certain people, that are working on this like research problem or this research project, right? And it's not in all of Adorno's work or all of Horkheimer's work, but it's there and they like focus on that later. Uh, and part of the process of working it out, I think, is, coming up with this idea of, right, traditional Marxism to sort of like disentangle it. But of course, it's more complicated with that because it's also like, it's also part of all of these like ongoing debates that are going on, right? That I think are often lost because people enter into something from like one position, or they like learn about the category and they don't know like what was happening beneath it. Like, like Western Marxism itself, right? Which only became this which only became this name that referred to this tradition, which was basically like invented by the New Left. But there were all these different people in the New Left who had like their favorite thinkers, and then it got this name, Western Marxism, when people were like moving away from it and wanted to sort of define it in this way so that it was this thing that was like dead that had to be moved on from. Um, I don't know. I don't know how much sense that makes, but I think that's my sort of initial reaction to some of these questions. I think at least, the Adorno argument would be like, you know, justice can only be realized in communism. But what do other people think?
Yeah. Hey everyone. Um, I just had a question. You know, yeah, in reading uh things for this week, it feels like I'm somewhat convinced that like Adorno's conception of like the exchange abstraction isn't this kind of like sense of like just exchange, not like without surplus value, without these other things. But it does feel to some extent like it ignores. or sidesteps like some of the broader dynamics of like capitalism, like in terms of like surplus value, in terms of, I mean, like he's making a connection, but like, I don't know, maybe in terms of like, let's say, a concrete analysis of a concrete situation or something along those lines. Um, that it does. So yeah, I guess I wonder, like that feels somewhat abstract still to me. So I guess I wonder like what you would have to say about that kind of sense of abstraction and this connection between Adorno's critical theory and the critique of political economy.
I guess I would have two responses. My first would be I don't think that the critique of political economy provides the level of concretion that seem to want from it. I think you need to rely on other people to get there. And I guess my argument would be you can see more of like a concrete analysis, if you read like late capitalism or industrial society. Maybe it's not concrete enough or concrete in sort of the way that you want it to be. But I think you can see there that, at least in terms of his interpretation of Marx and crisis theory, that he does at least try to derive mid 20th century, Keynesianism sort of from the dynamic of accumulation to argue that things that people argue have led to, capitalism no longer existing derive at least from sort of counteracting tendencies. Uh, you know, and I- I'd say it's closer than here, you know. Whether it's like what you want from it is another question. So maybe let's talk a little bit more about like, what kind of concretion it is that you want. Um, and how do you get there from the critique of political economy? Not trying to be like, aggressive or anything, but I'm like generally interested to hear.
Yeah, I think I think maybe what I want is like, I don't know, something. I mean, I guess I'll say like just personally like what in terms of like an ideal average of like capitalist social relations, what the critique of political economy kind of provides, which maybe isn't what Adorno's actually like trying to get from it in some way, is like a kind of model against which we can or like through which, like, I don't know, in some sort of like mediation with which we can kind of like look at the things around us and understand them in a way that like brings them to a sort of totality, like that brings like some perspective of totality, even if it's like a negative totality or something there. And I guess what I feel is maybe wanting in some of these texts from Adorno, from me, is like a sense that like there are actual like levels of mediation between the objects that he's analyzing and that kind of perspective of totality. That it feels like sometimes there's an immediacy to the assumption of like the exchange principle or something like that when like criticizing an object on kind of like a different level or something. That, I don't know. Yeah, so I guess that's what I would say.
Anyone else want to jump in?
It seems to me that this might also be a bridge to the static and dynamic piece. Oh no, James, you go first, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, so first of all, thanks, Chris. This is, I mean, It's a fantastic translation. Every time, because I think I read it like several years ago, and every time I go through, I find something else that both, sheds tons of light on what is more or less like an implicit sort of reading. I think at one point in like 39, Adorno has Horkheimer write a letter in response to someone who's criticizing Adorno's reading of Marx in like the regression of hearing article for the Zeitschrift. But Adorno doesn't himself write the answer. And like some of this is prefigured there, but this is just so illuminating for their work all the way back into the 30s, it feels like. But I wanted to say, especially on the question of the concrete, and I know this is going to connect up to the static and dynamic. I don't remember what the context specifically for that one was, but I think it was for a series of talks. I believe that Horkheimer also delivered one at the same, sort of, I don't know, like presentation series or something on possibly those categories. I'm not entirely sure. But I wanted to know more about, and maybe this will help with the concrete aspect, which is the reason I'm asking this question. And I hope at the very least it's not totally out of left field. This is an introduction to a sociology course, right? So this is like basic sociological concepts or something like that, which is again, giving this, incredibly complex, heterodox interpretation of Marx and, basically like value form theory in like the basic concepts of sociology. He's addressing a room of sociology students, I'm going to assume here. And like these are also the people that he's discussing. So I know that in the static and dynamic, it's Comte. I know that here he's going to be talking about like Rusto and a few other figures. But I was wondering about this as like a sociology text, because this is one of the places where it seems like we get, I'm thinking of like in the society essay also delivered in, the mid 50s around the time of static and dynamic, where he's going to talk about the way that there are sort of levels of mediation in society, such that, for instance, there's one level at which like the iron law of wages appears to be correct, I think he says in the essay, which when you zoom out is part of more general laws of like the extraction of surplus value and capital accumulation. So this is sort of what I wanted to ask, which was about the possibility of like, if we're supposed to be looking for the concrete connections here, I'm imagining him setting up like a gesture to do that as an intervention in sociological research at the time. Or perhaps there aren't necessarily those kinds of concrete moments for one of two reasons. Either because, like he does in Static and Dynamic, where he gets very excited about people accusing Marx of confusing levels of abstraction, and where he's like, exactly, this is why this shit rules. Like he gets excited about that in that piece. That's a possibility, but it's also that maybe he thinks that what's important is precisely remaining at that abstract level, almost in like a harsh corrective sense to disabuse people potentially of some problems he finds in sociological research at the time. So I guess my question is about connecting the concrete stuff to the fact that this is a sociology lecture and this is supposed to be, like basic concepts of sociology, and this is what he's delivering there.
I guess the other point or question I would add would be, what is the move that he usually makes? We don't have this whole like course to hand, but I'm thinking of like the later lectures from 68, Introduction to Sociology. What's the move that he makes there that people like Charlotte Bauman sort of argue is missing, in sort of the Neue Marxliteratur interpretation of him, right? Is the way that he moves to concretion is like the move to micrology, right? So there's like the abstract, and then it's like, okay, we're gonna spend like the next lecture, we're just gonna talk about this like pack of mints, guys, and we're gonna talk about like how mediation appears in that. So I'm not saying that that is like a defense, but maybe it's what happens next. I don't know off the top of my head.
Maybe an attempt. It's not exactly a defense. Like I think I agree with the idea that obviously like this should not be the only text of Marxist theory that exists in the world, and there should be it would require concrete other exercises of Marxist theory if a free world were to come into being. But I think the reason I think Adorno takes this tack maybe at this high level of abstraction, or something that at least occurred to me about the power of this move in both of these pieces we read. Um, and again, I'm going to try to relate this to the overall sort of theme of the series. But I'm thinking of a figure from Lukács's Lenin book, and Lukács says the great thing about Lenin is not just that he's a sort of like you know a genius opportunist who has a very concrete sense of what levers to pull to like blow up the state or something. But Lukács says it's this thesis of the actuality of the revolution, or the idea that you mediate all of those concrete interventions to the goal of the dictatorship of the proletariat and socialism, things like that. So it's this idea that really, when you're faced with this massive social data, it requires the sort of endpoint to really even illuminate what you want to get out of that concrete sort of account in Marxist terms. And I raise that because I do think this is a different kind of because it's I don't know, I was thinking about like the sort of like Jameson concept of cognitive mapping or something. Like there seems to be some idea that Marxists are supposed to build a picture of the world, like we're supposed to, somehow it would help the revolution if we knew the exact number of dollars and cents moving around like the logistics chains and things like that at a particular moment. We had like a very detailed picture of the way that value was moving in the world, and that would be what the point of analysis would be. Um, Whereas I think what Adorno is getting at here with the static and dynamic is that he is saying that at a certain level, um, you could change those things in a whole bunch of different ways. And in a meaningful sense, they would be the same things. You could have, you could have your super hyper globalized capitalism, or you could have your late 19th century more liberal capitalism in like the US or the UK or something. And really, you're talking about the same thing. Like there really isn't there's a level at which you're talking about the same social relations that just reproduce themselves in their same unfreedom. And if you don't, I guess, keep that level of abstraction in mind, it's not really going to do much for your concrete analysis. And I think that's the sense in which he is posing this as against a kind of you know like Soviet bloc productivism. Also, this idea that it's like, oh, you just have a really powerful concrete sense of how to master the productive forces and move resources around and do X or Y. But this horizon of realizing the sort of bourgeois right of the proletariat, this thesis of the dictatorship of the proletariat, things like that, those things have receded into the background regardless of your sort of like Marx certified commitment to concrete attention to the productive forces. So I think that is at least my sense of what remains sort of like powerful in this sort of move to this level of abstraction, or this insistence on this level of abstraction at that level. Jake.
I hope you don't mind me asking a kind of new or taking us in a different direction, because I had a sort of Marxological question. In my intro to the philosophical terminology lecture, I kind of accused Adorno of not paying enough attention to the distinction between exchange value and value. And I wonder to what extent you find that um, to if you find that to hold here, or if or if that's kind of or what you make of that claim. I think that like in shifting in using exchange value instead of value in a lot of moments, or insisting on their kind of identity, I understand just actually what Andy was just saying in the last comment, this kind of departure from a productivist Soviet relationship to value is like foregrounded, because if you just say value, then it seems like value has some kind of permanence in a way that exchange value maybe rhetorically obviously doesn't. That like you couldn't be a productivist of exchange value. It wouldn't make any sense. You kind of have to be a productivist of value. And so, in that way, I mean, it kind of gets at this like the question of like it what um yeah, the question of the imminent transformation of value into some new socially mediating force versus like the calls for the abolition of value, which much more align with exchange value as a concept in some ways. So I wonder what you made of that stuff, Chris, but anyone.
I think the Marxological point is definitely right. Um, I don't know the reason for that. My new my new pet theory, which I have not developed in any depth at all, is actually, trying to think like what is it, you know, people talk a lot about like impersonal domination these days. People talk a lot about social domination these days. And like the way that it's come to be interpreted is like, I don't know. In some ways it's like alien to me. Like I don't really, people are just like talking about like the market as this like self-contained sphere that sort of like interferes with society a lot of the times. And I don't know where they're getting that from. But it's led me to this new theory, which that is, I think, in part that it's the Grundrisse, right? Because there's no distinction between value and exchange value in the Grundrisse. And the chapter on money talks about impersonal domination in a way that has much more to do with, that also talks about how that relates to like private will and subjectivity, and doesn't just think about it in terms of the market, but in terms of the social process of money and mediation. Uh, so I'm not saying that Adorno is doing this deliberately, but perhaps it's like something that he's picking up on from all of these other people, like Schmidt and other people who supposedly are giving him like the passages from Capital that he's like using in negative dialectics or in his lectures. And maybe it's inadvertent there, uh, but maybe this also sort of explains this, emphasis more on social process, right? And money and exchange value than production. Uh, but I think all of these points sort of relate to this passage in the seminar on 250, where he's comparing himself to two sort of Soviet interpretations of Marx, but also like modern economics. And here, and maybe we can think about like to what extent this also you know, relates to what Andy was saying about Lukács, but like in a different way. Uh, and it's just the first paragraph. I'll read it, but he says, he's the immediate thing he's talking about beforehand is like critique of like, well, I'll read that too. He just says, subjective economics is essentially an analysis of market processes in which established market relations are already presupposed. Engels rightly invokes the heritage of German philosophy. The question was concerned with constitutive moments through which surplus value comes about, with imminent conditions through which the system comes about, while subjective doctrine attempts to elegantly formalize already established processes. By contrast, Marx is not concerned with a description of market society, but instead inquires about the constituents of experience and provides a critique of these categories of economic activity. This approach, which proceeds from the problem of constitution, is deeper. It enables more of reality to be expressed. The point is whether constituents of totality can be seized. The question of constitution is already present in the ostensible discretion concerning where to cut through reality for the purpose of abstraction. Subjective doctrine is essentially apology. The analysis of the question of price is an epiphenomenon in contrast to the question of constitution. So, maybe that also relates to sort of the points about abstraction, that we were talking about. And maybe that's his argument for why abstraction is actually the most concrete you can possibly be, because it's what allows you, rather than mapping like price movements and stuff, it allows you to map like what can actually be, communized, for lack of a better term.
Chris, do you know if Kroll was in this seminar?
I don't. I don't know who else was in the seminar. Um, yeah. And I guess maybe if someone wants to know, they better email Reichelt, Uh, now that Backhouse is no longer with us, I can't imagine very many more people. Maybe there's records of it somewhere, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know if Kroll was in the seminar or not.
Mac, do you have something? Oh, okay.
No,
Sorry.
I was just going back in. I was eating dinner.
No, I appreciate it. Um, so I have, if no one else has something, I wanted to raise because Zachary's not with us, but he's been raising this question of self-critical nominalism throughout the series, and so I feel almost, I have to raise the interesting sort of characterization of Marx's nominalism here, or his somehow he's both and neither a nominalist and a essentialist, and both and neither a commitment of on what page is that? I forget the page, but he says it's invariant idealism and at the same time descriptive positivism. Um, so I don't know. I guess I wanted to raise that as mostly a question for the group: is how do we do we think that this is a kind of useful way of construing Marx's relationship to Hegel or to the Hegelian tradition or to the very extended comp section and the static and dynamic, also this question of the tradition of a kind of sociological positivism, um, because it seems like here it is basically all justified on this very particular sense of what it means that the sort of exchange abstraction, and then in capitalism, the sort of its autonomization as socially necessary labor time and accumulation and surplus value, that these are sort of objective concepts, is what one wants to say. So it kind of invalidates or sort of makes it unclear the extent to which one can both hold that and be committed to some kind of actual opposition between, say, like positivism and essentialism, or idealism um, and sociology. I mean, Chris, you raised in your introduction Gillian Rose's Hegel contra sociology, for instance. I know James and Jake you're both also interested in that text here. So it seems like Adorno is kind of at least if we take this uh, yeah, real abstraction, and it seems here, and it's a different kind of sense of real abstraction probably than its own Rethel, even if it has a kind of family resemblance to it. Um, but it seems like if we take this idea of the objective conceptuality of value seriously, then that would require a revision of a lot of these other uh, theoretical oppositions, I guess, that are important to various people in this group. might also just be a way of asking Chris, is this distinction that he draws here like an important one to you, or one that you have found useful for other things?
The distinction between
This idea of nominalism, because he opens the piece
Mhm.
with this question of Popper's supposed nominalism and positivism, right? And so it's interesting that that's his way into teaching a course on sociology and introducing Marx, is the kind of tradition of sociological positivism and nominalism, things like this.
Yeah, I mean it's a shame Zachary's not here. Because he's thought about this issue a lot more than I have, to be honest. It's not like I said, I feel like the the interests that I originally like interpreted the seminar for have like, are still guiding how I even think about it to now. Like I didn't when you mentioned that part, I was like literally like, oh, he must be talking about the discussion of nominalism in static and dynamic because I didn't even remember that it was in that part in the seminar. But the discussion of it in static and dynamic is actually really interesting too. Um, where he also talks about Marx's nominalism there on page 44. Unless other people had had thoughts about it.
I don't have like thoughts about that or almost anything because I've missed most of this series. So I'm a little like I'm just gonna be the stupid person in this room and that's fine with me. I was wondering about I've been reading this sentence on 42 in static and dynamic like sort of over and over again throughout this conversation because I can't figure out it's this like sentence fragment and it might be my interest in it is just like comes from discussions with Andy over the years, but he says he's sort of ripping into rationality, nominalism, and positivism all at once in these sections. But he says, moreover, there can be no freedom without speculation. The positivists who paid lip service to freedom were plotting to depose it all the while. Um, and I'm just like very curious. Okay, so there's a critique of earlier Marxological alienation on the grounds that if you reduce Marx to that, you just end up with left Hegelianism. There's a critique of Lukácsian reification, but a return to reification, I think, in the other one, he uses like reified to describe the way that exchange value arises. So it's a very concrete, as opposed to a Lukácsian, maybe ideological reification. It's like something like an abstract economic process. Um, Okay, all of this stuff, how does the speculative dimension fit in to these all of these various logical moving parts? Because like on a certain level, right, the dictatorship of the proletariat has to be speculative, right? Or like has to contain some level of um, imagination or something. We haven't seen it in reality. That's a very basic point that a lot of people have made. But in your reading of Adorno, how does speculation fit in?
That's I that's a question I honestly do not have a complete answer to. You know, I guess, I guess in regard to this question, perhaps, what differentiates it from sort of positivism and nominalism goes back to issue of, the abstract and concrete, and the question of social constitution. It's being able to see, you know, past these, and the question of mediation, right? And essence and appearance. And maybe speculation is sort of being able to see that the whole is the false, and that it has to be moved beyond that in order, well, to go back to justice, right? In order for justice to be realized or for suffering to end, would be my initial thought. You know, any anyone else sort of working on these issues now? Thinking about these questions, have any further thoughts?
Well, okay, so if the speculative dimension is something like, or the thought process there is something like the whole is false or totality is what is false,
Mhm.
then can what is true, and we know like in general you can't get to truth with recourse to empiricism, or as Adorno is famously trying to say, like or with recourse to an economic uh trying to react against like the accusation of economic reductionism by like paying attention to actual economic processes. That also doesn't work. So does that just like relegate the true to the realm of the not yet or something?
Probably, yeah, it probably does.
Okay,
Or
that's kind of what I thought. Yeah.
or to the stuff on like metaphysics and negative dialectics, it's
Right.
like it's like the beyond.
Mhm.
I might venture that. Oh, James, you want to go?
Oh, sorry. No, you go ahead. I'll be in the queue.
Okay. I think there's another way to figure it, and I might want to do this just because I'm a little bit wary of the of what I regard as like the pure negativism of a lot of like contemporary uptakes of like this sort of idea that Adorno is posing here. That we should just have like a abstract opposition to commensuration and exchange and value and things like this. Um, because I think like part of it, and this would be like the conflict with Popper or with like sociology, is that um, notably Marx does not start from the facts, he goes from the abstract to the concrete. And the abstraction he starts with again is not like society or something. He starts with equality, identity, a kind of a concept of justice already, in the sense of like if you put two people together and they have to exchange their commodities, if they have to exchange the products of their labor to survive, you're going to get something like this dynamic of commensurating based on labor time. Um, and so then in Capital Chapter 1, before you even introduce separation of producers from means of production and things like this, you get value out of what is basically a speculative category of justice or equality or identity that develops out of the sort of social metabolism with nature based on exchanging labor. So this would be all this to say that that's that to me is a speculative thing to start with, to say that I'm starting with this idea of even though it exists nowhere in the world, and especially not in capitalism, as Marx will go on to develop. You won't find this anywhere existing in capitalism, but you also really won't find it anywhere in pre-capitalist history, that there were like communities of people that were exchanging based on average labor time. So it's a kind of speculative start to the thing, to be like, if people exchange and want the fair exchange, then in the context of separation of producers from the means of production, this is what we get in the context of socialized production, right? In general. Um, so I think that to me would be the speculative dimension of it, and where it wouldn't purely be And that's why Adorno wants to insist on it being an immanent critique of liberalism in the sense of realization of liberalism's own principles. He wants to say, like in negative dialectics, he says we want to realize fair exchange despite all of our, uh, protestations about the exchange principle and things like this. So to me, that's how I read the speculative character of it, because there would be nothing to in the kind of empirical science, sociology presuppositions that would validate that kind of starting point, and I think that's what is part of what he's getting at. I don't know, James.
I was going to say, I think on the issue of, speculation here, I think that what's interesting is, like to a certain extent, I think speculative for him means, especially because he brings it up first as an insult, I believe, that it's something that it's dismissed as idle speculation. Marxist theory is dismissed as that by the positivists. And so it could be the starting points that they use, although, like Marx himself will, also criticize similar starting points. This is the other thing, which is like in Capital, if, like you said, it's an immanent critique of liberalism, like in its presuppositions, a lot of it is whenever Marx is going to tell his own different, multiple conflicting versions of like social contract theory, kind of, he's always going to be playing with the accepted stock of sort of like speculative starting points from the liberal tradition. And so like that seems to be a moment of it. Maybe it's like forcing people to recognize like the both abstract and hypothetical constructive moment that's already operative in liberal theory that pretends to be sticking strictly to the facts. But in his own speculation, it's like it seems to be that the speculative moment is necessary for critique of the given, both the givenness of society and of its theorists, I think, and sociological theorists, as Adorno is going to point out, I think in both the readings today, where, like you have to be the speculative moment. Without that, I think that dimension seems to open up where he's like, the problem with false consciousness is not that there's like determinate correct or incorrect content of consciousness. It's that consciousness under the conditions in which it arises in this society is itself false. Right? Like that seems to, and it's real is the other thing, right? When he talks about reification in the lecture here. So that seems to be, part of the speculative moment. And that involves, the actively playing with, and I think, like Marx is going to, playing with the presuppositions of economic theory and like writing his own different competing versions of contract theory in like every text that he does, for instance. But if I'm allowed to totally derail the conversation with two questions. One of them it was about, maybe this is related, this is to Chris. It's the question about his critique of Marxist epistemology or lack thereof. I know that he has comments where he'll like have throwaway lines where he's like, Marx is to epistemology as a bull is to a china shop. Like he loves bringing that out in his late lectures. And I think you mentioned this in your sort of condensation of what's going on in the lectures here. So that's the first question. The second question has to do with sociology again, because I'm going through this and I'm reading this, like, what are you supposed to get from this? Again, it's like a sociology student. And it seems to be is the opposition to all previously existing forms of sociology, as Adorno himself says at the beginning of the lecture. Fucking fantastic. But I also think it's interesting that in terms of, framing it as sort of a sociological intervention, a sort of anti-sociology, and then ending with this sort of appeal to think beyond the given, that seems to be the moment of speculation, right? Like where he's like, what is the problem with all previously existing sociology? It takes for granted the existence of society as it is. It takes for granted the society which produces the data that we then are supposed to register or merely record, kind of thing. But the question about sociology stuff made me think of what was their previous, like forays into sociology, especially with like applied Marx theory. And that tended to be in the 40s in the studies on prejudice stuff. It was the class theory rather than the value theory. And it was the stuff on class domination. So that was my second question, which is about maybe specifically like what is it that the value form theory or Marxist theory of value gives the sociological perspective? Is it something like the kind of anti-sociology that he seems to want to really impress on the students in this class, where he was like, first things first, we disagree with every previously existing school of sociological thought. Fantastic way to start off the lecture. Is that what that's supposed to be? So then, yeah, two questions, epistemology and why specifically for sociology then value Marx's value theory rather than even other ways that they themselves have used Marx in sociology, like class theory, theory of class domination and stuff in the studies on prejudice. So yeah, epistemology and value theory for sociology.
Okay. Epistemology, I mean, yeah, it's like the comments, it's interesting that the way that that insult to Marx is translated. I think Ashton and Redmond translate it differently, maybe because one is like the English version and the other is the American. So one is like, one is the elephant in the, China shop or something. Uh, but I think basically the argument there is, that, you need, some facet of epistemology to be able to like think, you know, think about equivalence, or move beyond that and to think about, the how equivalents are unequivalent. So, that's sort of the arguments that you see in sort of negative dialectics about needing this like conceptual moment. And then how I think, of course, this being Adorno, he just argues that they are like interrelated. You know, the the bad literature makes the move to say, well, here he's like getting rid of Marx and saying everything is based on like instrumental reason from time immemorial. But at least, maybe my bad interpretation is he's just he's problematizing it and saying that they're both interrelated. And you can't just get rid of one without the other, and you need both, and that further complicates things. The second question, I think, you know, I think your answer is convincing. How do you begin to tell students about sociology? Well, you tell them about what differentiates your approach from all of the other ones, and that is your notion of society. And and maybe there we can talk about another interesting terminological issue, which is how in the lectures a lot of the times when he's talking about Marxist categories, he describes them as sociological categories, right? And he doesn't talk about them in terms of like political economy, because the emphasis is just on their sort of sociological nature and their sort of relationship to society as such. Uh, it, so I mean, my guess would be it is probably this move to, walk in and blow these like children's minds like wide open and be like, oh, and you also see that move like in the philosophical elements of society, philosophy, and sociology, where he introduces all of these like, here's Durkheim, but what does Durkheim get wrong? Well, he doesn't have this like moment from like Marx, where it's like essence and appearance and it's tied to society. So I think it really is like, this, move, this critique, this way of like pulling the rug out from under everything else, and then maybe bringing it back in, returning to Durkheim, returning to his, different ideas that can be then placed on this sort of edifice. But, it's this way of, I think, maybe introducing society in this unique way. And I guess the way that we could test this theory, if we wanted it to be like boring sociologists, would actually be to look at that textbook that was translated, that in some ways I think is actually like the best introduction to the Frankfurt School that nobody ever reads. The one that Beacon Press put out, and I think maybe I can just check right now, but I think that's how they introduce it, right? They talk about this stuff and then they move on to like the family uh, and to other sort of sociological categories. Yeah, aspects of sociology. Yeah, because it begins with, right? It begins with the society, right? It begins with this thing, you know, basically it's the talk Jameson translated. Then it moves to like the individual, the group, masses, culture, art and music, empirical research, the family, community studies, prejudice, and ideology.
We have time for probably just one more question if somebody has an absolutely brilliant insight to close out this series. James, thank you. Taking up the mantle.
Sorry, this is not an insight. This is another question. I wanted to ask about communism specifically because it appears in both of these pieces, which somehow I missed that totally when I read Static and Dynamic previously. But I think, this especially series has helped me look for that moment even more so than I had before in Adorno's work. And so there's the section in Static and Dynamic on, let's see, this is, and I think he refers to it as a better society. Yeah, on 44, a better society will synthesize the static and dynamic, which are now linked in a contradictory fashion. It will not seek to preserve what happens to be, to tie men down for the sake of order, since no such fetters are needed when the interests of men coincide with those of society. Very interestingly enough, rhymes very strongly with the final lines of this lecture manuscript from Chris, which is the objection that socialism leads to massification. To that objection, one must reply that the latter will disappear only when individuals are no longer determined by relations of exchange. So yeah, I wanted to ask about these two moments of communism where it comes out so strongly. And one of them, it's the better society. I think he also says free society somewhere in Static and Dynamic, possibly also in the lecture series, but ends this, I think, interestingly, with socialism after he does sort of the parallel critique of the fetishization of theory in the East, and then the taboo on theory, or the prohibition on theory, the danger of theory even in the West. So yeah, that's where I wanted to push those two moments, because it seems like it's a remarkably concrete moment. He's using the word socialism, which again is rare compared to things like better society, rational society, free society. So yeah, I wanted to ask what people thought about those two moments, especially because I was kind of blown away by that ending there.
One thought here, if no one else has something, and if so, someone else should definitely have the last word. But one thought here was that the what seems to underlie, and maybe this gets back to the Hegel contra sociology, Gillian Rose thing, where the idea of having a Rose's idea is that sociology is kind of bad thought, right? Whereas Adorno seems to have this account of the contradictory objectivity of the concept of value. Both means that there is plausible speculative sort of accounts of society as a singular organism qua spirit or something, but there's also a necessity of sociology insofar as that those speculative determinations are contradictory and have to be managed in a whole bunch of like slapdash ways that are explicable in terms of sociology. Like one couldn't have thinking of, say, like a speculative account of why like sexism and racism are necessary for freedom sounds perverse, right? So there has to be things that can't be, one can't just say you deduce it speculatively from the necessary determinants of human freedom or something. At least that's my pushback against this Rose opposition to sociology that I think Adorno is getting a little bit more right. But what I think is interesting here in the static and dynamic is his idea that somehow socialism or the ultimate sort of horizon of communism are beyond the opposition of static and dynamic. I think really for him that means that they're beyond the sort of general singularity of society that one could just deduce from what society is as concept, how people should behave, that there's going to be a kind of multivalent freedom there that would not be deducible from a kind of singular speculative account, a la Hegel or something like that. I guess that would be my one thought here about the path from or the relationship between the ultimate goal of communism and the necessity of sociology that seems to be like the interesting thing between these two texts. I think that's it. I'm sorry. I looked at the clock. I thought that would go faster.
Pretty good last word. It's not that
um,
bad.